You step into a room where the walls are painted with angels. The ceiling glows with gold leaf meant to honor God. But the floor beneath your feet is cold marble, scattered with chestnuts, and crawling across eton hands and knees are 50 naked women. Around you stand men in scarlet robes, their faces frozen between horror and complicity. At the center of it all sits a figure in white and gold, laughing. This is not a brothel. This is not a pagan temple. This is the Vatican, and the man laughing is the Pope. Before we descend further into this night, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from. It still amazes me that a story this dark, buried for centuries, now reaches people across continents, all seeking the same thing: the truth behind the myths. Let's go back. October 30th, 1503. Rome, the Apostolic Palace. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, has just announced that his daughter will marry again. Her name is Lucretia Borgia, and by the age of 21. She has already been widowed twice under circumstances so suspicious that even hardened diplomats whisper about poison and daggers. Her first husband fled Rome, claiming assassins were hunting him. Her second was strangled on the steps of the Vatican itself, and every finger pointed toward her brother, Cesare Borgia, man whose name alone made kingdoms tremble. Now a third groom has been chosen, Alfonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Duchy of Ferrara. He does not want this marriage. He knows what happened to the others. He begs his father to refuse, but refusal is not an option. The Borgias do not accept no. They accept submission, or they accept war. And so Alfonso travels to Rome, knowing he is not going to a wedding. He is walking into a trap. What Alfonso cannot yet imagine, what no one in Europe could imagine, is that his wedding night will become one of the most scandalous events in the history of the Christian Church. A night so depraved that chroniclers would struggle to write it down. A night that would fuel revolutions, inspire reformations, and haunt the Vatican for centuries. This is not a story about love. It is a story about power. And what happens when power decides that nothing, not faith, not dignity, not even the sanctity of marriage is sacred. When Alfonso d'Este entered Rome in the winter of 1503, he did so with a small escort and a sinking heart. The journey from Ferrara had taken him through frozen mountain passes and muddy roads. But none of that compared to the dread that settled over him as he approached the Vatican. It loomed above the city like a fortress, half cathedral, half prison, wrapped in scaffolding and shadow. Inside, the welcome was overwhelming. Pope Alexander VI sat on his throne, draped in white silk and clothed of gold that shimmered in the candlelight like molten metal. Beside him stood Cesare, silent and still, his eyes fixed on Alfonso with the intensity of a predator measuring its prey. Cesare Borgia was 26 years old and already the most feared man in Italy. Entire families vanished at his command. Cities surrendered at the rumor of his approach. When he looked at Alfonso, the message was clear: you are ours now. Over the following weeks, Alfonso endured what could only be described as psychological torture disguised as celebration. At banquets, he was seated beside courtesans while cardinals watched with thinly veiled amusement. On hunts, Cesare displayed a ruthless skill that felt less like sport and more like a warning. At receptions, Alexander made pointed jokes about the tragic fates of Lucretia's previous husbands, jokes that hung in the air like threats. Every gesture, every smile, every toast carried the same subtext: you will not leave here the same man, if you leave at all. Alfonso tried to maintain his dignity, but he was already a prisoner. His movements were monitored. His rooms were watched by papal guards. Every door he approached seemed to close just before he reached it. And while he endured this quiet siege, something far darker was being prepared. Cesare Borgia took personal command of the wedding night's entertainment. Behind closed doors, he met with his father to finalize details that would have horrified anyone who still believed the church represented something holy. 50 of the most beautiful courtesans in Rome were hand-selected and brought into the Vatican through hidden passages. These were not street prostitutes. They were educated, refined women who frequented the salons of nobles. Many wept when they learned what the Pope expected of them, but none dared refuse. They were dressed in lavish velvet and silk garments they would later be forced to remove. Servants who witnessed these preparations crossed themselves repeatedly, whispering prayers that clung to their lips like frost. Even Lucretia sensed it. Though deliberately excluded from most of the planning, she felt the tension thickening in the air. Her maids reported unfamiliar faces slipping through corridors, courtesans appearing in rooms where they should not be, and Cesar moving through the palace with a smile that made their blood run cold. The night before the wedding, unable to bear the suffocating atmosphere, Lucretia fled to the Sistine Chapel. Beneath Michelangelo's vast painted sky, beneath the hand of God reaching toward Adam, she collapsed to her knees and prayed, not for love, not for happiness, but for rescue, for intervention, for anything at all. But the chapel remained silent. The divine felt impossibly distant. And outside, the Vatican continued its preparations for a celebration that would blur the line between ritual and atrocity. The wedding ceremony itself was held in the Papal Chapel, a chamber drowning in gilded walls and holy frescoes. Alexander VI officiated personally, his booming voice filling the sacred space as he bound Alfonso and Lucretia together before God. Rows of cardinals stood rigidly along the walls, our faces carved into masks of piety. But behind their practiced devotion flickered something else: dread. Every one of them sensed that this ceremony was only the prelude. After the vows, the guests were escorted to the Borgia apartments halls, resplendent with frescoes painted by Pinturicchio. Stories of saints and heroes stretching across walls that were about to witness their desecration. Enormous tables overflowed with roasted boar, pheasants still adorned in their feathers, pyramids of exotic fruit, and goblets of wine from the finest vineyards in Italy. Cardinals, Roman nobles, emissaries from Ferrara, and hand-picked courtiers filled the room. Alfonso and Lucretia sat at the head table, trapped in a celebration that already felt unreal. At first, the banquet unfolded like any noble feast. Music drifted through the air. Toasts were offered. Polite diplomacy performed. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere shifted. Alexander, flushed from heavy drinking, grew louder, more jubilant. And then Cesar silent, until now slowly rose and delivered a subtle command with a tilt of his head. The massive doors slammed shut. Guards took their positions. No one would leave this room. What happened next tore through the last boundary between decadence and depravity. At Cesar's signal, the side doors opened, and 50 courtesans stepped into the hall draped in velvet and jewels, but unable to hide the terror in their eyes. A hush fell over the room, thick as smoke. Then Alexander rose from his throne, smiling as if unveiling a masterpiece, and announced that the true entertainment was about to begin. At his command, the courtesans began to strip. Every layer of silk and velvet slipped to the marble floor until they stood completely naked before the assembly. A cathedral built for prayer now stared at a scene torn from a blasphemous nightmare. Cardinals turned their heads away, fingers tracing frantic crosses over their chests. Some tried to rise and flee, but the guards shifted forward, hands resting on their swords. The message was unmistakable: no one leaves. Alfonso could only stare, his face frozen in disbelief. Lucretia sat beside him, petrified, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, soaking into the silk of her wedding dress. Then came the Pope's next order. The naked courtesans were commanded to dance between the banquet tables. Servants lit towering candelabras, and the flames cast jagged shadows across the frescoed walls, saints and angels watching silently as the Vatican devolved into something pagan and profane. But Alexander was only beginning. Baskets of chestnuts were brought in and scattered across the polished marble floor. The nuts rolled between the feet of horrified guests, the sound echoing like faint thunder. Then the Pope announced the next phase. The courtesans were to crawl on all fours between the legs of cardinals and nobles too. Collect the chestnuts, like animals driven into a grotesque contest. The woman who gathered the most would be rewarded with silk cloaks and gold jewelry from the papal vault. What followed was so extreme that Johannes Burchard, the Vatican's master of ceremonies, man hardened by years of witnessing scandals later, wrote that he struggled to describe it in words. 50 naked women crawled across the sacred Vatican floor between the robes of church princes, while Alexander and Cesar watched from an elevated platform, laughing, pointing, placing bets as if this were cheap theater. Some young cardinals, drunk and overwhelmed, laughed and cheered. Others bowed their heads, crushed by the war between their faith and their terror of the Pope. Alfonso sat motionless, unable to comprehend that this nightmare was part of his wedding feast in the Vatican itself, under the eyes of the man who claimed to speak for God. And Lucretia, her wedding dress had become a shroud. Her tears had dried into a frozen expression of emptiness. She had always known her father and brother were capable of monstrous things, but she had never imagined they would turn her wedding into a ritual of damnation. Yet even now, the night had not reached its darkest point. As midnight approached, Alexander finally declared the end of the chestnut banquet. The exhausted courtesans huddled in corners. Wine soaked the tables. Guests sat frozen, half drunk, half stunned, entirely broken. But Alexander was clear-headed, focused, intent, and his next command silenced the hall so completely that one could hear the candles crackle. He proclaimed that Alfonso d'Este must prove the marriage with Lucretia not once, but 3 times, and not in private. Every witness present was to remain to verify that the union was sealed irrevocably before both the Church and the world. The hall descended into horrified silence. Even Cesar looked sharply at his father, caught off guard by the sheer audacity of the decree. Alfonso rose slowly, his face drained of all color. He was a prince raised on ideals of honor and duty. But surrounded now by armed guards, their hands gripping their sword hilts, he understood there was no refusing this command. He turned to look at Lucretia. She trembled like a bird trapped beneath a predator's shadow. Her eyes were vacant, her spirit already battered beyond resistance. Under the murderous gaze of the guards and the expectant stare of the Pope, Alfonso had no choice. He escorted Lucretia toward an adjoining chamber. The doors remained wide open. No privacy, no humanity. What followed was not a union. It was the destruction of 2 human beings. Witnesses stared in stunned silence. Some whispered desperate prayers. Others wept quietly. Even the courtesans, victims of their own degradation, looked away in grief. And as the night dragged on and the Pope's horrific order unfolded, a single unspoken truth filled the Vatican. Something sacred had died in that palace. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, Lucretia had slipped into a state beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. Her mind, desperate to survive, had separated from the nightmare unfolding around her. When it was finally over, when Cesare announced triumphantly that the marriage was now bound 3 times, sealed in the eyes of both Church and loyal, Alexander lifted his wine cup in satisfaction, smiling as if the night had been nothing more than an extravagant celebration. What remained were the survivors. Cardinals who had entered as servants of God now stood as unwilling witnesses to an atrocity they could never confess. Their silence had made them accomplices. When the sun rose fully over Rome, it revealed devastation. Empty wine jugs, chestnuts crushed into marble, exhausted courtesans curled in corners, guards standing like statues with downcast eyes. In the adjoining chamber, Lucretia lay completely still, staring upward as if the ceiling were miles away. Her body remained, but her spirit was elsewhere, somewhere unreachable. Alfonso sat at the edge of the bed, trembling violently, his face buried in his hands. Nothing in his life had ever shattered him like this. Within days, he left Rome quietly, returning to Ferrara with a silence he would carry for the rest of his life. Not once did he ever speak of the night again. The story could not be contained. Word of the banquet spread like plague. Whispers in Roman streets turned into murmurs across Italy, then erupted into reports sent to courts throughout Europe. Ambassadors wrote in coded letters. Priests spoke in veiled warnings. The Venetian envoy famously wrote, "What happened in the Vatican surpasses even the darkest imaginations of ancient Rome." Across Europe, preachers seized the tale as proof of Rome's moral rot. Among them was a monk named Martin Luther, who would later cite the Borgia feast as a symbol of everything poisoned within the Church. Meanwhile, Borchardt recorded it all in his diary, aware that his account might either vanish under Vatican secrecy or one day stand as the most damning testimony ever written. Lucretia never escaped the shadow of that night. She moved to Ferrara and tried desperately to craft a normal life. She funded charities. She protected artists. She nurtured beauty. But those who saw her privately described the same thing: a lingering sorrow, eyes that had seen too much. She bore children with Alfonso, but their marriage, irrevocably poisoned, was a hollow shell. Lucretia died young, at 39, giving birth to her 8th child. Her last recorded words were, "I am ready to be free, at last." Freedom, something she had been denied her entire life. Alexander VI died only months after the banquet tremors whispering that poison. The tool he had used so often had finally found its way back to him. Cesare Borgia, stripped of power after his father's death, fell in a lonely ambush in Spain. His body was mutilated and thrown into an unmarked grave, far from the grandeur he believed he was destined for. But the night of October 30th, 1503, did not die with him. It became a symbol and icon of corruption so severe that it fueled the flames of the Protestant Reformation. The story survived in Borchardt's diary, in whispered warnings, in the collective memory of a church forced to confront its own darkness. Even today, more than 500 years later, the chestnut banquet stands as an infamous reminder of what happens when absolute power loses all restraint. It warns us that humanity's darkest acts are often committed in the places meant to be most sacred. The past is not dead. It watches, it warns, and it asks us, quietly, what we would do if we stood in that room with the doors locked. The guards watching, and the man in white and gold smiling down from his throne.